Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the NRRI webinar, Microgrids, Policy Pathways for Progress. This is Tom Stanton, Principal Researcher at NRRI, and I will introduce our moderator for today, Honorable Lorraine H. Akiba, Commissioner Emeritus now from the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. Lorraine's term just ended at the end of June, so she has served on the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission now for just about 6 years. Prior to becoming a commissioner, she worked in private law practice, heading environmental practice groups at 2 different law firms with a special emphasis in environmental and natural resources law, in addition to practice in commercial and business litigation. She's currently co-chair of the Low Income Community Solar Working Group of the Low Income Issues Forum and a member of the Resiliency Strategy Steering Committee for the City and County of Honolulu. Commissioner Akiba has previously served as a member of the Advisory Council to the Board of Directors of the Electric Power Research Institute, the Board of Directors of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and its Energy Resources and Environment Committee, the U.S. Department of Energy and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory Future Electric Utility Regulation Advisory Group, and the State and Local Efficiency Action Network, which is called the C Network, Financial Solutions Working Group. It's been a real pleasure to work with Lorraine for the past 6 years in my role as NRRI staffer, and we're very happy to have her today as our moderator. Lorraine, would you like to take over, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm very privileged and honored to be the moderator for this fabulous panel, Microgrids, Policy Pathways for Progress. So we have a great lineup of speakers, including Tom, who just graciously introduced me. Tom Stanton is a principal researcher for the energy and environment at the National Regulatory Research Institute, also known as NRRI. Through the years that I've served at NRRI, Tom helped staff the ERE, the Energy Resources Environment Committee of NRRI, and he has worked at NRRI since fall of 2010. Tom specializes in policy research for renewable energy, energy efficiency, grid modernization, and global climate change. And Tom's work for NRRI with state public policy research papers about all kinds of distributed and renewable energy resources, microgrids, that's why he's on the panel today, solar energy, energy storage, and non-transmission alternatives. And he is a longtime and proud resident of Michigan, and he worked for Michigan State government for over 32 years, with 10 years at the State Energy Office and over 22 years at the Michigan Public Service Commission. We also have joining us as the panel, Larissa Dobriansky, is Chief Business and Regulatory Innovations Officer at General Microgrids. She focuses on regulatory, institutional, and financial changes that can leverage the capabilities of advanced microgrids to deliver integrated energy solutions to power systems and communities. And like Tom, she draws upon over 20 years of experience in the energy, environmental, and financial regulatory fields. She helped shape new financing mechanisms, market designs, and utility regulatory reforms that can capture the value that a very intelligent, dynamic microgrid system can provide to the grid, market, and communities. And that's why she's going to share her perspectives on that with the panel today. She's her efforts are focused on incentivizing investment in advanced microgrids that optimize distributed resources. And so she's going to tell us more about advanced microgrids and what that means. She's also served in senior management positions within the private sector in the U.S. government. She formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the National Energy Policy at the U.S. Department of Energy, where she spearheaded many significant pieces of legislative authorization, and in fact, for the department's first loan guarantee program for clean energy technologies and to move technologies out of demonstration and into the marketplace. We also have with us Dr. Farouk Rahimi. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT, along with over 40 years of experience in the electric power industry. In his current role as Senior Vice President, Market Design and Consulting at Open Access Technology International, which some of us know better as OATI. Dr. Rahimi oversees development of market design and consulting activities of OATI and is also a key contributor to OATI's smart grid and grid modernization products and services. Before he joined OATI in 2006, he also collaborated with the California ISO in Folsom, California for over 8 years, where he was engaged in market monitoring and design. And his prior experience also includes 8 years with Macro Corporation, which subsequently became known as Kima Consulting, with also various other consulting firms, including ABB in Switzerland. So we also have a very informed industry expert on this panel today. So you are going to be very blessed with a lot of the industry information he can share. And to round out our panel, also, we have Jean-Anne Ramey. She is the Executive Director of Climable.org and co-founder of Resilient Urban Neighborhoods, also known as RUN, the working group, and co-founder of Synapse Energy Economics. Jean-Anne is the Executive Director of this organization, where she has directed and supported economic research projects regarding the human health and societal impacts of energy use and global climate change. And her presentation, as well as her work, focuses on how to best communicate climate science and clean tech issues to the general public so information is accessible and actionable. Currently, the RUN team that she works with, the working group, is engaged in low-income community microgrids that leverage a grassroots-driven approach by partnering with local organizers. And the microgrid is truly a community-led effort. RUN's technical expertise combined with Climable's plain language forte have led to the hybrid virtual microgrid model, which ensures most economical measures and creates maximum resilience in vulnerable neighborhoods. So you're going to hear more about that in her part of the presentation. As co-founder of Synapse Energy Economics, she organizes the development and achievement of current and long-term organizational goals. She's also worked as an economist in the Electric Power Division of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities and as an analyst at TELUS Institute. So thank you very much, panelists, for joining us. And without further ado, let me just launch us into the topic here and with Tom. I think why I'm moderating this is Hawaii's PUC back in 2014, in our very well-known white paper, Inclinations on Hawaii's Utilities of the Future, we first laid out a framework, a regulatory framework to encourage our utilities in our state to embrace and incorporate microgrids, we call them integrated energy districts, into their resource planning and into their power supply improvement plans. And I think the concept that we had in mind was really what Larissa had talked about, you know, the advanced microgrids using technology and distributed energy resources, and enabling and empowering customers to be part of that in a community-based solution. Hawaii now leads in terms of resiliency efforts as an island grid, and I think it would be interesting to hear how microgrids also can serve for resiliency purposes, and many of the speakers are going to address that. And many of the states across our country are looking at microgrids for resiliency, and we can cite projects such as the Marcus Garvey Village project in Brooklyn, which was an award winner for NRRI's Task Force on Innovation Award, all the way to Alaska, which is looking at you know, alternative energy, distributed wind microgrids to address the needs of their rural communities. So microgrids are now happening across our country, and so we need to look at what policy pathways continue us to move forward on this progress. So Tom, can you take it away?
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate your introductions. We'll get started. Audience, if you have questions anytime, you have a questions tab over on the right-hand side of your screen as part of the GoToWebinar control panel. Please feel free to type in questions at any time during the discussions as you think of them. Also, I want to let you know that the slide decks that are attached to our NRRI homepage right now at each person's name, have additional slides that we won't be showing you now during this presentation in the interest of time. We asked everyone to control themselves and jam their presentations into no more than 15 minutes so that we leave plenty of time for discussion. So we've done that, and you'll see by slide numbers, I'm going to skip several slides that are part of my overall presentation. So I'm doing some work right now on a paper about the energy ladder, and that's the name of progression of energy products, and very much comes from discussion on the part of the United Nations and the World Bank about how to bring basic energy services to those parts of the world, estimated over 2 billion people when this effort started, where there wasn't really any access to reliable electricity at all, and people had the use of what are generally considered to be primitive fuels and kind of dangerous equipment for lighting and heating and cooking in their homes. So that's where the energy ladder concept came from originally. I'm going to present on these topics that are listed on my slide 2, and I'm going to just go right ahead with it. Slide 3 is a picture of an energy ladder. This is my depiction of it, looking at all these different sizes, from the very smallest individual appliances that are typically called solar lanterns, or some people call them pico grids, meaning ultra small grids. Then you see some next step solar home system that might be on the order of anywhere from, say, 10 watts to 70 watts up to 100 watts, where there might be a very small solar home system with a panel, some batteries, a few lights, maybe 1 or 2 very small wattage appliances, and then all these other steps. And not everybody uses the same names for every step. Sometimes people think and say that mini grids are bigger than microgrids. Other times, other people say microgrids are bigger than mini grids. So these are the names that I've adopted as I've started to study this and do some work on it. And you'll see I drew a big circle around those that can be serving only a single utility customer, as opposed to those that would serve multiple utility customers. Very often the way that laws and rules are set up about utilities, there are certain things that a single customer has the right to do on their premises by themselves, but if they want to do this with multiple customers, it enters into a whole different kind of regulation. So that's why I just draw the distinction. On slide 4, you can see that I'm trying to make the case that some of these same energy ladder steps make sense both in the part of the world where we already have a pre-existing grid, and also in the parts of the world where there might have been no grid to begin with, and we're just trying for the very first time to bring services to those people that really did not have any access before now. So that can be at these levels of the individual loads served by a standalone piece of equipment, or a piece of equipment that is capable of being plugged into the grid when that's a good idea, when it's good for charging a battery, for example, but otherwise can be unplugged from the grid and used on its own separately. Then we have these remote facilities that might be long distances away from other facilities and small loads. The whole state of Alaska is served that way, really, by a series of not interconnected microgrids, each one serving its own small piece of geography and not interconnected with a major transmission grid like much of the rest of the continental United States. Then mini grids, sometimes with redundant different power supplies and backup services that serve critical power needs, needs that people consider that they don't want to ever lose power to certain appliances or certain functions, so they create a mini grid for serving those purposes. Going on up all the way up to this idea of very large campuses with campus-wide microgrids that provide high reliability and resilience to a larger campus. On slide 7, I've skipped a couple now, but on slide 7, you see these different pathways. What the traditional development picture was was this idea that we're going to bring out the wide area grid, hook up all these new buildings to it, and then start inviting those people to use the electricity that is served by a wide area grid. That's very expensive to do and may cost several thousands of dollars per meter that gets connected that way. So these other options are now being used more and more in other parts of the world. An energy ladder development where we bring out these pieces one at a time for consumers, hoping that each step that they take helps them to be able to live better, maybe have a improved economy in their household, and maybe then help move to the second step or third step or fourth step. And then there's a concept being talked about now where there's a idea of leapfrog development, and this is, in a way, it's similar to what happened with telecommunications, as parts of the world went directly from no telecommunications to cellular phone systems without ever building out the wired telephone system grid in between. So this is the idea that we could maybe see the same thing happen with electricity development, so that we end up with either isolated individual microgrids or clusters of microgrids that might never get interconnected with a wide area grid. And that discussion has been going on largely in the developing world, especially in Africa and also in the Caribbean and other places. The next slide has got a couple little definitions. This is slide 8, talking about from the World Bank perspective that both these ideas, on-grid and off-grid, are going to be very important to developing in the near term. And noticing that the enabling environment has to be there either way, the right kinds of institutions, policies, strategic planning, regulation, and incentives. And then something that I'm proposing be added to this thought process at the bottom of this page, that each one of these products and services be fully compatible with one another and scalable, so that eventually they can all integrate seamlessly into either a single microgrid or multiple microgrids, and eventually possibly into a wide area grid. Slide 9 talks about why the United States utility landscape is changing to make these ideas, more practical and more worthy of consideration. I think this list ought to be getting to be very familiar with all of us in the regulatory realm, because we're seeing these topics play out over and over again, different places. Slide 10 talks about what's different now for customers or consumers. And there's a link in this page to this project called Sustainable Energy for All. That's the name of the worldwide effort under the auspices of the United Nations to bring this kind of sustainability and energy services to the whole world, to everyone in the world. And we are seeing more and more of these different changes. And again, I think most of these are getting to be quite well known to all of us, that we're seeing these ideas about consumers evolving into prosumers, and increasing electrification of the different kinds of end uses that we have. Maybe things that used to be powered by a liquid fuel or a gas fuel, now maybe switching over to be electrified and run off of electricity. And more increasing choices for portable power devices that people can pick up and take with them as they move. Slide 14 shows some of the examples of these smallest systems, what are called solar lanterns or solar home systems at the very smallest scale. And there's a reference there to this Global Off-Grid Lighting Association. This is just a picture of a very small part of their total catalog of the products that have been certified by them for use in these growing markets. And notice that this market estimate is $20 billion over the next 5 years worldwide. And a similar estimate says that eventually we're going to need about 200 million separate mini grids or microgrids in the rural parts of the world to bring these services to more and more customers, and maybe they will never interconnect with a macro grid. So I've listed now some of the ideas for how does this make sense in the part of the world where we do already have a wide area grid. And So here's a preliminary list. Customers want the ultra high reliability for certain kinds of end uses or certain kinds of facilities. Sometimes the consumers are going to value portability and the ability to use pieces of equipment or appliances off-grid in the things that they do. Sometimes as non-wire alternatives, if we group things together and have them managed as a microgrid, that can already be fully cost-effective in helping a utility to deliver services without necessarily building the next part of the macro grid or wide area grid network and so forth. So I think, again, some of these are starting to be regular part of our thinking in the regulated utility world, but really showing up as different reasons why this discussion is starting to take place now. The top barriers where these wide area grids already exist are sometimes very similar to where there is no grid, but sometimes we have rules set up that make it very difficult for third-party providers to participate by bringing these products and services to customers. Sometimes there are rules that prohibit the use of private wires, and sometimes when customers self-generate electricity, they have added utility charges for BYO or bring your own distributed generation. Many cases we have an incomplete understanding of the full benefits and costs of distributed energy resources, and we can have poorly designed standby rates, poorly designed compensation for energy outflow back to the grid and so forth. Anti-islanding interconnection rules that don't allow customers to island intentionally when that's practical and serve themselves. So as we think about developing these kinds of techniques in different utility service territories, we may run into one or more of these kinds of barriers, and that's what needs to be addressed in thinking about moving forward. For my own research and what NRRI is working on now, we're going to try to continue describing and defining good, sound regulatory approaches and incentives for each one of these steps in the energy ladder. Whether those projects are led by a regulated utility or provided by a competitive supplier, in both areas with and without the pre-existing wide area grids, and for all these different scales of technologies that can operate either standalone or grid connected or dual use, which means sometimes they're grid connected and sometimes they're not. And then we'll also be looking at different case studies of what's going on with these development scenarios in different locations. And then finally, here's a list of some of the regulatory challenges for the places that do have a pre-existing grid, and this will be the focus of some of the research that I'm doing now. And I'm trying to think if there's anything special we need to draw your attention to on this. I think at the very bottom, think about how your existing laws and rules in the different states make it easier or harder for a single customer with a single facility or a single campus to engage in some of these kinds of activities. Or many states are now engaged in creating new rules and regulations for what we're calling public purpose microgrids, where it may be multiple customers, each one of which serves some special public purpose, and we feel they're necessary facilities to run even in the event of a grid outage. So we're making special provisions for them to be able to provide microgrid services. Or for the last one, multiple customer facilities and multiple campuses so that these microgrids reach across different customers. That's the introduction that I wanted to give you all today, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And now we're going to proceed with Jean Ann, who's actually going to discuss and address with us some of the pathways for enabling microgrids for the benefits of not just the utility system, but community economic development. Jean Ann, your turn.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Akiba. And thank you, Tom, for inviting me. This is a really exciting opportunity to talk about work that is really meaningful to us at Climatable. So we are a woman-run nonprofit, and the way we communicate about climate change and clean energy. A big part of that is by getting engaged in on-the-ground projects. And with the complexities that come with the electric system and climate change, microgrids definitely stand out as an amazing opportunity. But when we started looking into the possibility for working here, one major missing piece was how to work well with communities and get the people who are most affected by these technologies to be interested and up to speed on what's going on. So I think, Tom, you're advancing the slides. So next slide. Thanks. We work with a team of technical experts that we call the Carnival Consortium. So this is, they have a variety of skills, and we turn to these folks to compose project teams, and they're a great bunch of people. I'm going to move pretty quickly through the slides. So if you have questions of things I don't cover, my email address is on the front. Please don't hesitate to reach out. And secondly, I'll say that we're really getting deeply involved in this work, and we're making up a lot of it as we go. And if anyone on this call knows of other people engaged in this work who are doing it well, please introduce us. If you know people that want to get involved, that would be a good introduction as well. So the inspiration for this work came from the idea that if microgrids make sense on university campuses and for large industrial customers, then there are benefits that could accrue to low and middle income people. We also value energy democracy, so we really try to encourage leadership from the community in determining what kind of energy people want to rely on. So again, microgrids are a great opportunity. The people that are best served by some of these technologies are vulnerable people to begin with, often communities of color with high immigrant populations. And not only are they already underserved, but they are likely to be the first impacted by climate change events and probably the most seriously affected by these events. So if we could look at slide 4, back one, yeah. Among the benefits that we will bring with the clean energy community microgrids, resilience stands out at the top, and it's really important to people, and it's also really hard to quantify. When we think about resilience, one way of approaching it is to allow immobile residents to prosper in place. So anytime there's a natural disaster, it causes displacement. Some folks are unable to leave their homes. This immobility might result from age or physical disability. Often there are language barriers, and poverty impacts this a lot. So there may be a lack of access to transportation, and people may not have a place to go, unable to pay for a hotel room like a lot of people would do if their power is going to be out for a number of days. So this new community asset will not only ensure that there is a basic level of electricity that is available during a crisis, but we are also strengthening community ties. So the ability of this person-to-person networking that happens when people are engaged in a project that's meaningful to them and it's close to home, those bonds will also serve the community well during a time of crisis. So for example, a person might learn where to go to charge a cell phone if they need to reach loved ones and let them know they're okay. Also, understanding where people have a right to go for shelter. So again, with language barriers and other challenges this is going to be a major benefit. So there are revenues, so peak shaving and ancillary service revenues that we think could have the potential to be really big. This is where policy can have a major impact, just making sure that microgrid participants, owners, and everyone will be compensated for the value that they provide to the grid. So there's a lot to understand there. I guess slide 5. So this is a draft because we're still working on it with collaborators. But I thought it was important to point out some of the types of buildings that we are working with: small nonprofits, multifamily housing, and small businesses. But the cloud up there is an important aspect that differentiates our model, in addition to the low income aspect. We're working with people who develop cloud-based optimization software, and one of the reasons that this is so important to us is that inclusivity is a major value, not only of our project, but of the communities and community groups that we're working with. And while we have sought out these major participants, major customers, so there are critical facilities and large anchor loads, we've also been doing a lot of outreach and community engagement and education, and people are coming up to speed on these things, and we've been approached by smaller building owners and homeowners with inquiries about whether or not they can also participate. I should back up and say that in doing the projects that I'm describing, we are being funded by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center to do 2 feasibility studies. I'll get to the details of those communities in just a sec. But this goal of inclusivity relates to being able to optimize what we would usually consider a traditional demand response program for properties that are not electrically contiguous to the core of the microgrid. So I should also mention that the first step in the work that we're doing will always be in every building doing the maximum amount of cost-effective energy efficiency. Another ideal combination, as we all know, is solar and storage. So on these disparate properties, we envision being able to bring the technology that is appropriate for their building and looping them into some of these benefits that will be available to the core microgrid. So on slide 6, we show you a little bit about our structure. So the Resilient Urban Neighborhoods team is a subset of that technical team we showed at the beginning. And when we realized that this was the work we wanted to do, we thought it was really important to engage with communities that were already doing work with community groups. So we reached out to the Green Justice Coalition, which is a network of about 40 organizations in Massachusetts that are working on environmental justice, and some of them are already doing energy projects. And out of that group, you see that Community Labor United is the group that convenes this network. We also get support for this group from Clean Water Action. And then 2 distinct community groups emerged from the larger bunch as having the bandwidth and interest in pursuing a project like this to the end. And those groups are Green Roots in Chelsea and the Chinatown Progressive Association in Chinatown. Next slide. So Chelsea is a densely populated urban neighborhood with lots of industrial processes going along. One of the biggest participants in this microgrid will be the New England Produce Center. We are currently only signed up to work with the common area, but this produce center is the distribution hub of all of the fresh produce that serves New England and much of the Northeast. So you know about environmental justice communities, people living close to heavy industry. It's true in Chelsea that folks here have higher than average rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses. So when you have facilities like the New England Produce Center and other industries that absolutely rely on continuous electric supply, what they do when there's an outage is turn on their backup generator, which is often fueled by diesel. So air quality goes down considerably during these times when people are already being challenged by possibly a storm, or certainly everyone's affected by electricity outages. So working with Chelsea, not only do we have the Produce Center, but we have Chelsea Housing Authority with 3 developments and 2 Chelsea Public Schools, as well as the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. So quickly, I'll talk about Chinatown. The next slide. So Chinatown is also densely populated. It, like Chelsea, is prone to flooding, and the industries there, not only Tufts Medical Center, but they rely a lot on the retail and the food service industry for their economy. And one thing that's really going to be challenging about Chinatown is the technical barrier of that they're in an area network. And so during our feasibility study, we're going to tackle that technical challenge. Let's see. Moving on. So I think Tom did a really excellent job of going over what a lot of the barriers are and the regulatory challenges. So I'll talk really briefly about what's happening in Massachusetts. So the Massachusetts DPU has outlined 4 goals for its grid modernization effort, and microgrids can help fulfill all 4 of these goals. We should skip slide 10. And then going on, so the Department of Public Utilities regulations, definitely there's a lot of work that needs to happen to flesh out the policies around the integration of DERs. We need to achieve advanced metering functionality. And in terms of mapping and system planning, we need a lot more transparency, and to really understand the revenues that are going to be available at this level. It's so important to understand what's happening at the nodal level and to really value these things properly. So slide 13 just goes into a little bit of what the utilities have proposed and what utilities are doing. So Eversource has proposed a new time varying rate. It's an opt-in. I think opt-out would end up serving a lot more customers. Probably not as big of a barrier in a microgrid because it's a small set of people, and we're really in touch with the folks, and they will be highly motivated to opt into this rate. So rate design for solar and energy storage is everywhere and getting bigger, and I think there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out in those policies as well. So I'll just conclude with the last slide in saying that this community engagement is a major factor in getting to a well-informed public. So policymakers can make the best regulations possible, and we really need for people to understand what the values are behind those policies and get engaged and get involved to be able to make some successful microgrids. So that's it for now.
Thank you, Jean Ann. I just want to make a footnote comment here because I think Jean Ann did a good job of addressing microgrids for resiliency concerns, and especially in communities, low, moderate income communities that are most impacted by some of the effects of the new normal of extreme weather events. And I think just a footnote to share from Hawaii, that is one of the reasons why in Hawaii we are really pursuing microgrids as a strategy for resilience centers, which is a community area identified for continued operations of critical infrastructure, with a microgrid using renewable energy and storage, or located to keep energy and power to key facilities in the area. And that could be infrastructure, it could be schools, it could be health services, essential services, water, wastewater, et cetera, for a community. And I think just to reiterate what Jean Ann said, that oftentimes, low, moderate income communities are most impacted when natural disasters occur. And so there are efforts at the state level and throughout the country at the city level to work on establishing, designing, and implementing resilient communities, and microgrids are an active part of that structure. And really, regulators, policymakers, and decision makers really have a role to play on that. And I wanted to just highlight in Hawaii, besides the role that the Public Utilities Commission played, our state legislature just recently passed, right before this panel was put together in 2018, with House Bill 2110, which directed the Hawaii PUC to establish specifically a microgrid services tariff to encourage the development and use of energy resilient microgrids. So it does take a collaborative effort across all government and community and utility stakeholders to make this happen. So let's move on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Farouk Rahimi, who's going to talk about regulatory and market design considerations to enhance microgrids and distributed energy resources. Dr. Rahimi.
Yes, thank you so very much, Commissioner Akiba, Tom, NRRI, and all of our attendees on the webcast. And I am going to step back and really in this landscape, look at where we are. Tom talked about some barriers. Some of these barriers to enhancement and flourishing of microgrids and distributed energy resources are not intentional. They are really the result of the inertia of the system that has been in place for many years from a regulatory, market design, and operational perspective. It's helpful, therefore, to put this pathway towards the grid of the future in the context of where we are and what is the target grid of the future to which we are moving. So can we go to the next slide? Yeah, these are the topics. Let's go to the next one, please. Yes, briefly talking about OATI, which is relevant to really what I'm talking about the roadmap of where we are going. OATI was established in 1995, where restructuring of the electric industry happened in North America. And at that time, transmission open access was the rule of the game. Drawing the parallel, what we are facing today is a version of that is really distribution open access, opening up the distribution to some of these new players in the arena, microgrids, aggregators, distributed resource providers, distributed energy resources, and so on. So at that time, there were some issues as to how to deal with this new paradigm, and OATI was established to provide software as a service to the energy industry, starting with the services to transmission and reliability providers, then later on to energy trading and risk management for the traders in this new arena. And as of about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the smart grid area, using those platforms and functions and experience to help with the new area of distribution open access and smart grid. The map on the lower right shows all of our clients, which are, NERC and FERC and ISOs, RTOs. The utilities are among them, a total of about 2,000 energy customers. The figure on the top on the left is a microgrid, which is really one of our data centers. Let's go to the next slide. Again, in the realm of that background, the electric industry operated as cost of service for about 100 years, about a century, and that was appropriate because demand was inelastic, and really cost of service was probably the best you could do, but this was not conducive to innovation. Even when transmission open access happened 2 decades ago, again, for the most part, demand remained inelastic. And if you look at all of the ISOs, RTOs, you see that a lot of market rules circle around the inability of demand to respond to prices. So you have mitigation measures, market rules to really protect demand against gaming and market power. Can we go to the next slide? With the increase of participation of demand-side resources because of new technologies, lower cost of distributed energy resources, rooftop solar, distributed storage, we have now a lot more ability for the demand side to respond to prices. We also have new actors in the arena, microgrids, community source aggregations, and we also have emergence of new constructs for what was traditionally our distribution utilities. We are now seeing the emergence of distribution system operators, or DSOs, that have a lot more responsibility, including facilitating some of the participation of these demand-side assets and microgrids in this new arena, as well as maintaining reliable operation of the distribution system. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, some of the things that are done with respect to these distributed resources, when they start popping up in the distribution utilities, a lot of concern was expressed that these new variable resources create operational problems. They also, because of the distributed energy resources, are hurting the bottom line of the utilities. But then pretty soon it was realized that all of these can be turned around to provide valuable services to the mutual benefit of distributed resource owners and operators, microgrid, as well as the grid operators. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so just to take the example of microgrids, the capabilities of microgrids, they can really contribute a lot to providing these grid services, both for the services that are needed to operate the distribution grid, as well as transmission and bulk power system by provision of various grid services. Now, some of the issues that emerge with respect to provision of grid services are some of the limitations on the microgrids. For example, at the point of common coupling with the distribution system, one of the issues is whether the microgrid is able or allowed to export power or inject power into the distribution grid or not. And that basically impacts the level or number of megawatts or kilowatts of service that the microgrid can provide to the distribution grid or to the bulk power. In some cases, we have seen examples that if exports are allowed, the level of some of these grid services more than double compared to situations where the export is not allowed. Now, whether or not the export is allowed in the distribution grid is really brings up another question and issue. Who is going to pay for the upgrades needed at the point of a common coupling of the microgrid to the distribution grid? And there are different opinions in this area that we see in regulatory discussions, in forums that I happen to be participating in. We have people on both sides of the camp. Some really maintain that, the microgrid should pay for those upgrades. Some maintain that no, microgrid is providing valuable service, and this is really beneficial to all of the users of the grid, so this cost should be allocated to everybody. So there are issues of that type that are being disputed. In some cases, for example, in California, to avoid some of these issues, they define some new resources. For example, California defines NGR or non-generating resources that basically does not look into this issue of whether you're injecting or withdrawing power at the point of common coupling of the microgrid with the distribution system, but regardless looks at the assets within the microgrid itself, generation and storage assets, and basically bundling of those assets in the form of non-generating resources to provide some of these grid services. And that leads us to the issue that more recently FERC came up with, which is Order 841. Let's go to the next slide first, and then we move to that. So this slide basically shows how microgrids can contribute to provide services to bulk power and distribution operations. At the level of providing services to distribution operations, that part has not really taken off substantially. One of the reasons is that the distribution operators do not really have incentives to do a lot more in containing the balancing of energy within their footprints. Just to give you a very simple example, across all of the ISO RTOs in the US today, that we have 7 of them, the cost of regulation, which is supposed to take care of variability of the net load in the system is allocated not based on variability of the net load, but based on the meter demand during an hour. So a distribution utility has very little incentive to try to control their own imbalances, because the benefit to power system operation in terms of reducing the need for regulation or frequency regulation, that is benefiting everybody and not just that specific distribution utility. So there is some need to revise some of these market design and cost allocation issues in order for these three layers, microgrids, distribution operators, and bulk power system operators, to work together harmoniously. With respect to direct participation in bulk power operation, that is shown on the right-hand side of this figure for provision of different services, particularly grid services, that is where the new FERC Order 841 really is chiming in to facilitate not just for microgrids, but for all kinds of distributed energy resources. So if we can go to the next slide, I will briefly touch on that. And this FERC Order 841 that came out February 15, 2018, was pursuant to an NOPR that was really issued 2 years earlier. And basically, it really tried to facilitate participation of storage in these ISO-RTO markets, but in practice, particularly in the FERC conference of April 10 and 11, this was implicitly extended to all kinds of distributed energy resources and microgrids. And one of the important things here is number 4, that a minimum size requirement of 100 kilowatts was stipulated. Some of the existing market rules have much higher minimum size requirements. For example, MISO, in order to provide some of these services, requires at least 1 megawatt. Let's go to the next slide. One of the issues in this order was that when these distributed energy resources or storage actually inject or withdraw into the distribution grid, and provide grid services at bulk power in this ISO-RTO market, they should be settled based on the bulk power LMP. They should be able to set the LMP's location or marginal prices and be settled on that basis. And this really creates some issues that have not yet been resolved, but they're under discussion. And that's the fact that between the pricing node of the bulk power, where the location or marginal price is determined, and the location of the storage or the microgrid, the point of common coupling of microgrid with the distribution network, there are things like distribution losses and congestion. So these impact the quantities that are actually effectively withdrawn or provided to the bulk power system. And if you look at the quantities and measure them at the location of the microgrid, then it is really what kind of LMP should be used to settle those. Let's go to the next one. I have a few more minutes. So in here, what we are really seeing is the important role that the distribution system operator can play. And here in this figure, I have shown the DSO as an entity in the middle, but the arm of the utility, which is traditionally the utility distribution company, I have shown it in a separate box. And this is intentional because this does not necessarily mean that the functional requirements of this DSO is really things that only the incumbent utility can do. The incumbent utility is in the best position to do it because whoever wants to do the role of the DSO to make sure it facilitates a market for transactions among all of these prosumers, microgrids with bulk power system operator and among one another, has to have practically a lot of functionality platform services that the distribution utilities currently have. That is really a separate issue that can be taken care of the same way that we took care of it at the bulk power by functional separation and firewall separation between the commercial arm and regulated arm of our integrated utilities that existed before restructuring. Let's go to the next slide, please. And here we really, this discussion leads us to the dispute or discussions that are going on about centralized versus decentralized markets. Now, we can have centralized market as we have right now at the bulk power. The bulk power, we also have decentralized market outside of the 7 ISO RTOs in the US. The rest are really bilateral markets. The same thing when you come down to the emerging retail markets. You can have centralized retail markets facilitated by DSOs, and you can have fully decentralized markets that are really basically that's where the transactive energy paradigm is going, and they're using things like the blockchain techniques to make sure that they basically can transact without involvement of a centralized entity to get in the middle of these transactions. Now, a happy medium can be a hierarchical retail market when you have several layers, bulk power market, then a distribution retail market facilitated by DSO, and then local markets. And the next slide, I schematically show this. If you can go to the next slide. Here, I'm showing some of these nodes at the ISO or bulk power level. Then there are some of the nodes at the DSO distribution system level. Then there are some bubbles, and these are the bubbles in the distribution for which there are import-export limits. There are things like basically capacity limits, hosting capacity limits. This could be boundaries of the microgrid with the distribution system. And so this presents a kind of structure that can be used to have a hierarchical set of these markets. Let's go to the next slide, and that basically identifies some of the things that we have talked about before. 3 main areas: the need for incentives and stable tariff structures for DER microgrids to invest, to actually emerge. Right now, for example, resiliency has been talked about. Nobody has monetized or put a value on resiliency to compensate people who actually invest to increase the resiliency of the grid. Then we talked about the DSO, and we have to make sure that in this process, the DSO has a sort of open, non-discriminatory tariff that can facilitate participation of microgrids and other distributed assets. And then we really want to make sure that the existing utilities in this structure have new sources of revenues with respect to provision of some of these unbundled services, the equivalent of which we have had in the bulk power to survive. Let's go to the last slide, which is my conclusions. And basically, I'll go to the last bullet. The regulatory provisions and incentive-compatible market design are needed to meet different stakeholder objectives and make sure that it promotes the basically environmentally friendly, consumer-centric landscape, allows distribution utilities to remain viable, and most importantly, ensures cost allocation based on cost causation, and of course, cybersecurity and consumer privacy. And with that, I will stop, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Rahimi. I think you've outlined in a very complex set of issues in a very straightforward way. I think that tees up, and when we go into the Q&A session, I know there's already some questions in terms of some of the issues that you just raised in terms of monetizing and how do we put value on on the microgrid in terms of the overall whether bulk power system or the distributed system. And these are the issues that regulators are dealing with, especially state regulators that have to deal with an overlay of FERC jurisdiction or RTO ISO jurisdiction. So I think we'll look forward to an interesting discussion given the questions that are coming in and some of the questions that you've also teed up. And rounding out our panel now, as our closer, is Larisa Dobriansky, and she's going to address the topic of advanced microgrids and also challenge us to think out of the box. So, Larisa.
Yes, I'm going to look down the line, longer-term horizon, on developing a regulatory ecosystem for advanced microgrids. So, first slide, next slide. Let me start with the definition of an advanced microgrid, what these are. And these type of smart microgrids could transform both our power system and community energy infrastructure. An advanced microgrid is an intelligent electricity delivery network that would interconnect, interoperate, and optimize loads, DER, and storage using a hierarchical control scheme within defined electrical boundaries that acts as a single controllable entity with respect to the macrogrid at the point of common coupling. This advanced network can island, connect, disconnect from the grid to enable it to operate in both grid-connected or island modes. It can balance demand with supply in real time, schedule dispatch of resources, and preserve grid reliability. A smart microgrid, an advanced microgrid, is built with smart technologies, information communications technologies, advanced control technologies that enable intelligently managed energy resource efficient systems. And in fact, these smart technologies can enable these advanced microgrid cells to nest within distributed networked electricity systems that could in turn be connected to the bulk power system. Network microgrids would allow sharing of generation, controllable load, and storage capabilities over wider areas for optimal energy and risk management. These advanced microgrids could cluster loads and DER units within an integrated autonomous system operated by microgrid controllers, providing intelligent energy management and smart delivery, avoiding problems of standalone and randomly dispersed DER. Taking a system of systems approach, these microgrids could provide cost-effective distributed control, cost-effective power quality, availability, reliability, resiliency, and even heterogeneous services, managing and optimizing dynamic sets of distributed intermittent resources. Next. These functionalities reflect the changing nature of microgrids, and we're moving in this direction, and these microgrids would evolve also in shaping and evolving an integrated grid. Advanced microgrids could deliver integrated energy solutions to power systems and communities, harnessing the net benefits of dispersed DER. They could shape an interactive, flexible, and innovative grid, and really offer a systems approach, like I said, to integrating DER and load side management, and shape the kind of integrated grid that would be designed to increase the independence, flexibility, and intelligence for optimization of energy use and management within local energy networks, and to integrate the local energy resources into both the smart grid and smart communities. By providing a system of systems solution, advanced microgrids could accelerate the achievement of policy objectives. But critical to all of this are regulatory and market reforms that would leverage these capabilities and capture the value of these energy and resource efficient systems, is what I'd like to stress. On the next slide, you'll see a depiction of a pathway for the involvement of microgrids, running from traditional microgrid, which is on a controlled environment and really is a niche application, out to the dynamic microgrid, and evolving correlated with the development of an integrated distributed grid. And it would involve an iterative and stage pathway from interconnection to integration to intelligent interconnectivity, running from a more physical basis of interconnection out to energy Internet of Things for energy sharing. Next, the advanced microgrid vision foresees the use of these smart enabling technologies to capture the full potential of fusing power and information within the electricity value chain and communities. Advanced microgrids would optimize DER for resiliency, reliability and efficiencies, yielding benefits that would go beyond the sum of the constituent parts of these systems. And these systems could expand energy sharing parameters by eliminating silos and supporting convergence between electricity infrastructure and other energy infrastructure within communities. This vision foresees building distributed network electricity systems, like I said, the networked advanced microgrid cells within Internet of Things enabled frameworks, connecting community users with energy using infrastructure through new layers of intelligence, information communication technologies, and integrated controls. These advanced microgrids also would support distributed, market-driven, hierarchical, security-constrained, optimal economic dispatch, and transactive energy. Next, but again, this all really requires literally a regulatory ecosystem to capture the value of these systems and the kind of change in paradigm to achieve a new grid design, resource valuation, and new rules for new utility paradigm. Central to this is developing interoperability and integration, the standardization for using DER and microgrids throughout electricity value chain. We need regulatory reforms that could incent investments in smart architectural design to advance interoperability and integration end-to-end, resource valuation methodologies and planning that allow for measuring consistently the full range of DER benefits and microgrid benefits, and to integrate these into utility planning, procurement, and investment decision-making, and a new regulatory compact that would change the incentives of traditional regulatory and market decision-making to be indifferent to ownership and focused on achieving the most cost-effective solutions. Next. So it really is focused here on changing utility regulatory incentives to be able to recognize the value of these advanced microgrids and monetize those benefits. To realign utility incentives to not only preserve our traditional values, but to create long-term customer value, to be able to overcome traditional biases of the legacy system, the limits of traditional cost of service and rate of return regulation that encourage overinvestment in capital spending. To get reforms to align utility earning opportunities with customer value, to reform traditional economic regulation to achieve more efficient allocation between capital and operating expenses, and to develop a results-based model using performance metrics and changing the nature of the utility's role. Critical will be providing accurate, appropriate value signals into the marketplace, reflecting long-term avoided costs and real-time value supply, the value of grid services to customers, as well as the value of customer services to the grid. And in doing all of this, assuring fairness and equity to all customers and achieving policy objectives. Next. Central to regulatory reform is also developing this new utility distribution system model that Barack described. California and New York particularly are leading in trying to develop changes at the distribution level that can standardize the use of distributed and demand-side resources as part of power system planning, grid operations, and power market trading. And the kind of changes that can shift us from meeting peak capacity and building more to profit to load profiling and optimizing investments, moving from measuring megawatts sold to measuring value creation, and to overcoming the traditional legacy assumptions that there is little role for customers to play in addressing system needs, and that centralized generation and bulk transmission invariably yield cost-effective results. Next. And California and New York are particularly evolving these functions of, as Brock described, distribution system operators, to be able at the distribution level to respond to dynamically changing market conditions and manage customer side resources. And to have the distribution system operator perform transmission system-like functions to manage distribution planning, investments, and operations. And I've listed here the kind of functions that DSO would perform, essentially to manage the impacts of proliferating DER in the marketplace, to harness the net benefits and mitigate adverse impacts on the power system. Next slide. California has been making a significant contribution in terms of DER valuation, distribution resource planning, and net benefits. The CPUC mandated that its IOUs develop and file distribution resource plans that essentially need to develop, first of all, systematic methodologies for assessing the capability of utilities to accommodate increasing volumes of DER, and also to assess when it will be needed to upgrade, as well as to identify where DER could be located for the greatest value to distribution systems. CPUC has also required demonstrations to test and validate these methodologies to evaluate hosting capability and to identify DER locational net benefits. Critical to this is data access, transparency, and information sharing. Next. The value of these efforts is that this will develop a common benefit cost evaluation methodology so that we can compare and monetize the benefits and costs relating to the impacts of DER. These efforts are defining core assumptions, identifying DER characteristics, and for the purpose of monetizing these DER impacts to determine net benefits, so that utilities can be in a position to compare DER solutions with traditional investments, applying existing and developing new simulation modeling and analytic tools. This creates a great foundation, but we need to extend it to not only assess the impacts and harness the net benefits of DER, but to look at the potential impacts of advanced microgrids and the benefits they could bring, which could be quite distinctive from these DER impacts when you're looking at DERs as individual technology applications or combinations versus the system benefits that advanced microgrids could bring, which might offset some of the negative potential impacts of DER. Next. And I think probably many of you are familiar, of course, with the New York REV proceeding that is developing a distributed system platform, which will allow distributed resources to be tracked, forecast, and traded within the distribution system. And this retail platform is being planned, designed, and will be operated to achieve the state's policy goals. New York REV is reforming the role of the utility distribution companies into distributed system providers, who will be responsible for establishing and managing these retail platforms to achieve state policy objectives while maintaining system reliability. Next. New York REV, I think, has made the greatest, or is among the states that made the greatest impacts, because here I think Hawaii has made, actually, I'm sitting right next to a representative. So in terms of changing the utility paradigm, and in the following ways: changing rate designs and pricing methods to provide true costing of electricity, offering increased granularity in the provision of electricity services, reforming the utility business model to use performance incentives, also creating opportunities for market-based earnings, and removing disincentives to using cost-effective third-party and operating resources. Bring about incremental rate-making reforms to the utility revenue model to move towards rates based on marginal cost to the power system attributable to a customer's energy usage, and striving towards dynamic price signals and rate design to reflect value of grid service to customers and the value of DER to the grid. Next. But in addition to economic regulatory reforms, we also need market reforms. And FROC brought out some of the types of reforms that FERC has been implementing. There are 5 areas in which I think market reform is essential to support the market development of advanced microgrids: pricing to increase the role and accuracy pricing to signal in the short and longer term energy usage and investment decision making, to expose the value of resources under system constraints and market conditions. In terms of market design, to remove barriers to market participation by new resources in capacity, energy, and ancillary service markets, develop new participation models based on the unique physical and operational characteristics of these new resources and key to the capabilities needed in our power system to qualify new market participants. And as Farouk mentioned in Order 841, FERC is making some significant inroads here with respect to energy storage, recognizing its distinctive physical operational characteristics, and also the multifunction nature of energy storage and other distributed resources. We need to facilitate, through reform, market animation, competitive offerings, but while safeguarding against market abuses, to take a comprehensive but differentiated approach to wholesale, ISO, and retail DSO functions, and to develop DSOs, I think, to perform transmission-like functions that can reduce the need for transmission and generation investments in bulk system flexibility, ramping, and reliability. And critical will be transparency and information dissemination to reduce information asymmetries, increase data access, but also protecting privacy and security needs. Next slide. However, while these reforms are laying an excellent foundation, we need to go further in order to support the market development of advanced microgrids, because these bundle really like microgrids and with aggregating DERs and DERs, and we need to break out particularly advanced microgrids and their unique technical operating characteristics and match regulatory reforms to these characteristics in order to recognize their distinctive values and to monetize those benefits. We need the kind of reforms that will recognize advanced microgrids' role in grid modernization. And as I said, to build upon DER reforms, but differentiate the capabilities of advanced microgrids in order to achieve higher performance outcomes through integrated energy systems for host customers, utilities, and communities. Developing value-based reforms to incent investment in locally based smart distributed architecture that could link and optimize energy using functions of diverse infrastructure systems and the built environment of communities. We will need to develop consistent, uniform, and verifier methods for valuing the benefits of advanced microgrid systems within communities and to craft reforms that shift from technology-specific approaches to integrated energy solutions to maximize value delivery at all time locational scales and to manage energy seamlessly and interchangeably with intelligent interconnectivity. And next, we'll need the kind of reforms that can incent the development of smart microgrids and network microgrids as sustainable platforms that could support even value-added personalization, really heterogeneous services through cloud technologies and data analytics, and to fashion regulatory forms to recognize both the upstream and downstream capabilities of advanced microgrids, what microgrids offer upstream to the grid as well as downstream to communities. Developing cost-effective decision support tools and methods for integrated community energy systems planning and development, and designing demonstrations that can perform scenario analyses to compare the cost-effectiveness of DER strategies as distinctive from microgrid strategies. And I believe that will show ultimately the value of microgrid systems approach, which supports integrated energy systems and would justify having integrated energy system developers as market agents. And lastly, last slide, kind of bring this together here in terms of the kind of regulatory ecosystem that would support smart microgrid development within an integrated smart grid, but that would both transform our power system and community, and to get the kind of regulatory reforms that can recognize and monetize the value of the systems integration, promoting iterative and staged development from microgrid development running from interconnection, integration to intelligent interconnectivity. But be able to bring out value, monetize the benefits of combining smart grid, microgrid managed distributed resources, and sustainable community energy systems for intelligent energy management. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Louisa. I think that we've had such an extensive, all of our speakers have covered a lot of information material. So, and I want to just reiterate that a lot of the material, is in depth in the slides, and we did not go over that, or we'd be like a 3-hour webinar. So I would direct the attendees to go to the NRRI website and download these slides, because there's a lot of information in them for future reference in terms of identifying what states laws and rules can facilitate or hinder microgrid development, and what are some of the models and what are some of the forward-thinking pathways to enabling microgrids, again, both to provide ancillary services and benefits to the utility system and grid operations, and also to benefit communities for some of the things that that both Larissa and Jean Ann and Tom talked about in a very global way, and not just in terms of the market issues. But there's a question that came in, and I think it actually cuts across all speakers. And really, one of the attendees asked us, what role, we all talked about monetizing and value, but what key role does identifying price or cost of development of microgrids really play in your analysis, and really the ability to accomplish some of these things that aspirational goals and steps for reform that all of you have talked about? People are saying, we have to get real here. Do the projects really result in lower costs to consumers? And if not, what are the other values to justify monetizing microgrid development, either for providing ancillary services or providing community benefits? How do we approach that, or how would each of you approach that? And I think each of you kind of touched upon it from your own viewpoint. And I think, given that we don't have that much time left for questions and answers, I think that's a good question that all of you can answer from your own perspective. You want to go forward, Tom, in terms of what you can elaborate on, a priority, mission critical, in terms of these types of the role of trying to determine value here? And
Sure, I'll go real quick and then pass it on in order, I guess. I'm seeing a lot of emphasis in the developing world on this idea that we can calculate the cost of setting up a independent mini grid or microgrid separate from the cost of extending a macro grid or a wide area grid. And right now, people think that it's going to be cheaper for literally hundreds of thousands of remote rural areas where there isn't much need yet for energy. Once we get there with wires and we get there with meters and electricity service, still the customers have very, very modest needs. In our developed world, we're seeing microgrid development in certain places as a non-wire alternative, and at least in the near term, which I don't know whether to think of that as 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plans, but in the near term, we can show definitively that this will be less expensive than another alternative. The big question is, over time, will we still need to bring the same size and amount of wires and transformers and macro grid to serve these clusters of customers? And I think that remains to be seen.
This is Jean Ann. I would say that for our model, first of all, when we engage customers in the first place, we're doing all cost-effective energy efficiency. That is a proven revenue stream. But for our purposes, we consider these first two projects to be prototypes, and they have a lot of societal benefits. So for us, we're getting a lot of pro bono support and foundation support. But because they will be replicable, it's in that multiplying of the microgrids across hundreds of sites that the real values to the ISO New England will become evident as a start.
Yeah, this is Farooq Rahimi. We do a lot of cost-benefit analysis for various kinds of projects, microgrids, as well as for distributed energy resources, non-wires alternatives, etc. And it all depends on where you're starting from and to what extent some of these benefits can be, in fact, monetized, because some of these benefits accrue across the system to everybody and not necessarily only to the entity that is investing in these projects. And basically, these are really incremental benefits compared to where you are and incremental costs. Now, in case of Tom, if you don't have a grid, of course, the incremental cost of the alternatives are much higher than the cost of microgrid itself. But when you already have a grid in place, then the cost of the microgrid has to be compared with the value it brings. And the value streams, as I mentioned, some of them are monetized in existing markets if the microgrid happens to be in the footprint of an organized market that can provide and monetize those services. In some cases, some of the benefits of the microgrid, there are no metrics today to monetize them. One of them is resiliency. Even the definition of resiliency and how different is resiliency from reliability. That really is something that, yes, papers are written on that, but exactly that distinction has not been universally accepted. For example, is the traditional measures of consumer average interruption duration index, KD and SAIDI and SAIFI, are those the result of improvements induced by a microgrid in reducing customer outages, or are they reliability measures that can be achieved even without the microgrid? So there are some of these areas where the benefits are there, but they have not been monetized. And in our case, when we do the cost-benefit analysis, we take those as basically tiebreakers in order to decide, comparing various projects, which one is preferred compared to the next. There is a lot more we can talk about, but I'll stop there because of shortage of time.
To me, looking at this, I'll take it from a
Larissa.
different. Oh, hi, Larissa Dobriansky. A different perspective. Without a doubt, microgrids are expensive, and when you look at the traditional microgrid, you know, this has been underwritten off the balance sheets of the customers that have developed it to meet their particular energy requirements. They're niche applications and entirely customized. But you can lower the costs of these investments by creating economies of scale and standardizing them. Standardization with respect to the equipment like the microgrid controllers and other equipment, hardware, and software that operate these systems. The more the standardization, that can lower the cost, enable replicability, scalability, and that will help very much. But there's another perspective here, and then also moving this, you know, kind of like out of the niche into the market mainstream, like to the community scale in this manner. But there's another perspective on this, and that is looking at kind of comparison between when you make changes to address system needs and new market conditions, which is going to be more cost effective, investing in probably pretty burdensome transmission and distribution upgrades and investments, or investing in a kind of solution that's very modular, flexible, adaptive, which you can scale to, you know, addressing your problem. Whereas it could well be that in connection with traditional investments in transmission and distribution to address change, you know, in systems needs, power system needs, market conditions, what will be invested in might not be too easy to change and modify and could lead to stranded costs. So these are the kind of considerations I think need to be taken into account in looking at the costing and cost-benefit analysis of microgrids as a solution.
Just as a conclusory remark, I think this is proved out in terms of the case studies and the successful microgrid implementation that has occurred, like I said, in those leading states. We talked about Alaska, we talked about New York, the Marcus Garvey Village project, where development of non-wire solutions and the ability to recover costs earned on distribution system improvements really gives the utilities a new tool in grid management. And resiliency, even though we don't have a specific monetary value on it, I think we just go back and look at what was the cost to mitigate or to remediate from impacts of Hurricane Sandy, Norma, Harvey. Look at what just happened in Puerto Rico, and we've experienced that in Hawaii with hurricanes like Iniki that were a direct pass over some of our islands. So resiliency definitely has a value. It's distinct from reliability, because when something has been broken and you have to repair and start from scratch, or there's an island-wide blackout, that's an extreme of value. So the resiliency, I think, even though we don't maybe have a specific metric for that right now, I think you can just look at FEMA records to see how much it has costed states, cities, counties to rebuild after a disaster hits. And if you can address that, adapt, and mitigate ahead of time with microgrids that remain part of a central grid system, but they can island off to provide critical infrastructure and minimize the impacts, there is definitely not only a societal value, but a direct economic impact value to that. In terms of, I think, state regulators, they'll still have to address some of the laws and the rules that either will facilitate enabling these kinds of things. And I would like to put a shout out for Hawaii, because I know Larissa mentioned performance-based rate making, and I would direct your attention to the Hawaii docket that just got opened a couple months ago. Unfortunately, before my term ended, so I can't really see it to fruition, but we are one of the few states that are actually the first state that's actually implementing a performance-based rate making schedule with actual performance metrics, outcome driven. We already have performance incentive mechanisms in place. So please stay tuned to see how perhaps we can achieve in Hawaii what Larissa envisioned for us in her presentation of as the advanced microgrids and integrating, with our existing distributed energy resources tariffs, our existing community renewables tariffs, and our existing demand response tariffs, so we can again achieve that kind of visionary future of using advanced microgrids to benefit not only the utility but communities. I think Tom's giving us the cue. We've got some slides up in terms of future NRRI programs, but before I turn it over to Tom, I want to also put a plug out for the NRRI Summer Policy Summit meeting happening in Phoenix in just next week. I think it starts on the 14th and goes through the 18th. We will have a microgrids panel. Many of the speakers that were on today's webinar will also be participating in more detail in that panel. So if you want to hear more about microgrids, please come to the NRRI Summer Policy Summit in Phoenix. You can still register. This will be a microgrids panel, will be part of the ERE committee presentation on Tuesday. And I would encourage you, if you've gotten a little teaser of what the issues are, please come to the panel at the summer meeting to hear more. And now, Tom, for the other next webinars that are available from NRRI.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I see almost 100% of the audience has stayed right with us until the end, and we did run over a little teeny bit. Sorry about that. We had participants from probably at least 24 different states. I know this subject is of great importance to many, many states, and recently there's been activity all the way from Alaska and Hawaii to Maine and Puerto Rico and many states in the Northeast. My own state of Michigan has got some legislation that's proposed, so we look forward to working with any of you more in the near future. I've put up here 2 different events that are coming up, a NARUC staff surge call on Monday, July 23rd. There's information here. And also next webinar from the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, Tuesday, August 14th. The next NRRI webinar will be in September. We think second week of September, September 12th, Wednesday, again at this same time frame. So watch your email for news about that. And a final thank you to Commissioner Akiba for joining us today and all of the presenters. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner.